This assignment is to build a sculpture inspired by an organic object. The first part of the assignment is for you to choose the organic object that's going to be your point of inspiration to build from. I have some things that I found here at home that I think will work well. First, I grabbed this clove of garlic from our kitchen, and I really like the way that it's not quite symmetrical. It kind of bulges out more on one side or another. I like how it goes from being really fat and wide to having a skinny point at one end. It's got some interesting texture on it. I think I could find ways to both easily simplify it and make it quite unique. Maybe still kind of look like a bulb of garlic, but not necessarily feel like I have to copy this exactly in order to make something really interesting. So I think this is going to be a good one. I also have lots of shells around the house, and I grabbed this one in particular because I love the way the inside part of the shell is exposed. I think this is actually a pretty complicated object. I'm not really sure what is the inside and what is the outside. I like the holes that go through it. I think it looks interesting a lot of different ways sitting on the table as it turns around in space. And I think this one would present a really exciting challenge and could be a really kind of a mysterious, evocative piece once I'm done with my version of it. I also grabbed this small house plant that we have because it sits in front of my desk that I work at every day. So I'm very familiar with this plant, and I love the way the leaves kind of reach out towards me in space. They have this kind of interesting thrusting forward quality to them. The leaves are kind of a little beefier, a little thicker, which I thought might help. I'm a little concerned about doing leaves, and I get concerned about doing anything that's really thin and fragile. For example, with these leaves, I'm gonna elect not to do the stem part of it. Something this thin and fragile, like a twig, or if you tried to do like a feather, it would be extremely difficult to make that in clay. Not that you shouldn't pick a feather as your organic object, it's just if you do, you're gonna have to really translate it to overcome the fragility of it, to realize it in clay, which is fine. Go ahead and pick something thin and fragile. Just realize that translating it into something more substantial, to realize it in clay, is going to be a main point of your project. You're going to translate whatever it is you pick. I'm not going to make an actual garlic bulb. I'm not going to make a real seashell. So there's always going to be a translation, and this project in a way is about you embracing that translation and making it your own, and recreating these objects through your own lens. Pick something that you can have the actual object there on the work table in front of you the entire time that you're building. For this object, I am going to roughly pinch out different shapes that represent each different lobe on this bulb of garlic. I'm going to let them firm up separately, and then I'm going to join them together to make my bowl. I'm going to start by taking some chunks of clay and roughly pinching them out. Allow yourself to just rough things out at this point, and then refine it as the clay gets more stiff. I notice some of the lobes have a longer, skinny end to them. Some of them are more rounded throughout. So with this one, I might keep it rounded and convex, but maybe on this one, I'm going to take the upper part of it and change the direction. And I'm also starting to think about how these are going to fit when I join them together. So I'm just coaxing the clay into shape with my fingers, And I know I want these lobes to curve around. So I'm bringing the clay around with my hands. Where I feel like I want it to swell out more, I'm pushing it in that direction with my thumb tip here. I'm trying to show you a variety of different objects, and hopefully one of these methods will click for you in how you're going to start building your piece. So with this pinch method of building, you can actually get quite large with individual sections and then make your final object even larger by joining them together. Just have that joining happen in the cheese hard state. It's starting to get a bit large, and I feel like it would really benefit from just some firming up. There's no good way for me to set this down now without it squishing or partially collapsing on one side. I've got a couple of rags here, and I'm just going to pillow it underneath. These are a variety of pinch forms that I've made that have firmed up somewhat. How they stiffen up in your work setting is going to be slightly different. It definitely depends on how thin the clay wall is. This one is a little thinner, so I'm not surprised that it's dried out a little bit more. It definitely depends on the weather outside. So to get my pieces in this kind of early middle cheese hard consistency, it's been about, I would say, 12 hours completely uncovered, and then I've kept them wrapped in plastic kind of loosely for another 24 hours until I had some more time to come back and work on them. One of the advantages of doing ceramics at home is that you can go and check how your work is stiffening up over time, every hour if you need to, and respond accordingly. If they're getting too stiff and you don't have time to work on them right then, wrap them up in plastic. I'm spending time here going around each of my separate parts, working on the shape of each one, because once I get them all joined together, if I start to change the shape, it's gonna affect the entire construction of the piece. So I want them to be as set in their shape individually as I can get them before I attach them to each other. I'm going to start to go around the edges of each piece just with wet fingertips. As it starts to dry, it's going to dry around on the edge first, and that's the area that I'm going to join together. So wherever they're going to touch to be slip and score attached in the next stage of building, I want to keep that edge of clay soft. When I join these together, I'm gonna start with them on a crumpled newspaper cushion so that the bottom part of it doesn't flatten out on the table. I'm gonna join these two together right here. Maybe I'll trim a little bit away on each one to make them seem like they really do fit together. Where I'm going to join them together, I'm going to slip and score, and I'm chewing up the surface of the clay in multiple different directions. I've already gone over this side twice. I'll probably go over it 3 or 4 more times. I feel like they're ready to join together now. So I'm going to put those two edges together, and the individual score marks are going to hook into each other. I'm kind of jiggling them back and forth a little bit to get them to hook into each other better. I'm going to squeeze the two parts of clay together, and then it's really important that you add another coil of soft clay over every slip and score joint on your piece. I put reinforcing clay on the outside of that joint also. It's really important that you use a healthy amount of reinforcing clay on all your slip and score joints on both the inside and the outside. Okay, so I have some more refining and shaping and manipulating I want to do on this piece, but I feel like it would really benefit from the joint areas where I attach the different sections to firm up some more. Gently run a little bit of water around. Then I'm gonna wrap about the top inch only of this piece. And I'm gonna leave this bottom section that I wanna firm up uncovered. With the seashell, I honestly wasn't sure how to go about building it. It doesn't have the kind of separate lobe-like sections that the garlic does, but I did notice through the middle of it there seems to be a central shaft, and I decided to start with that and then expand out the curving wall. I really like how the top part of it is curved, so I'm gonna make this top part here curved also. This is the center part of clay for my sculpture that I've let firm up for about 8 hours, just completely uncovered, and it's kind of semi-stiff now. I can still flex it a little bit, but it definitely has some firmness to it. So I'm gonna start to slip and score around the top of this and down around the side. With this piece, I'm kind of building it from the inside out. So I'm gonna take plugs of soft clay and push it into the area that I've slipped and scored and made ready to attach to. I'm taking my fingers and shoving the soft clay into those score marks. As long as the clay I'm joining it to is really soft, then I don't have to slip and score everywhere. But if I'm gonna join more soft clay to this area that's more firm, then I would slip and score to add more clay down here. So I'm gonna keep turning this piece around in space as I work on it and see how the various openings and edges move as I do. I'm not necessarily trying to copy the walls on here. I'm doing my own version of it. I'm basically keeping the piece just large enough that I can support it with my two hands while it's in this soft building state. And then as it firms up, I'll be able to extend it a little bit more around and towards the bottom especially. And that'll give me the last little bit that I need to make this significantly larger than 8 inches, which it's really not right now. One thing I really like about the original object is that it has several different holes through it, so you can see all the way through in lots of areas. I'm working now not just on extending and growing the clay wall, but also doing that in the directional shape that I want. So I really want to make sure that it continues to curve around. I almost try and imagine or visualize the shape of the wall in space before I start building it, so that when I do get clay in place, I already have a projected vision of the direction that I want it to grow in. As I start to notice that I'm collapsing it or flattening it in one area while I work on another, then I know that it's time to let it sit. I think this is kind of at a really interesting place right now. I really like the holes that are in it, and I like how the lines really carry you around the piece. I'm not sure at all what the front view is now, what's the top and what's the bottom, but I feel like it needs to sit and firm up a bit before I keep working on it. And I notice on the end right here, it's starting to get kind of dry at the tip. So I'm gonna keep this area soft by running wet fingertips on it, and I'm gonna wrap just that tip in plastic, and I'm gonna leave the rest of it exposed and let it firm up to the next stage of drying like this. Okay, I'm gonna try and make one of these leaves out of clay. There's just some great qualities in it and how it extends out into space that I really like. I'm just starting with a big chunk of clay, and I'm gonna try and rough out the whole shape of this object at once. It's not just the outline of the leaf here, it's also how it extends back into space. This is a really dynamic object, and it's definitely not flat like a tile. It comes out in multiple directions. In fact, that's something I think I'm going to want to exaggerate on this piece to make it seem like it pushes out even more and kind of leans back even more than the original object does. So I just started with one big solid chunk of clay here, and I am coaxing it. I'm curving it around a bit more than the original, exaggerating this kind of forward directional thrust that the original leaf has. I'm stretching the clay around, kind of dragging my finger across the clay to literally stretch it into the shape that I want. And I'm keeping it supported with my other hand underneath, not setting it down on the table, keeping it as large as I possibly can while I'm working on it. Here's a version of the leaf that I let sit out uncovered for about 8 hours. Then I wrapped it in plastic overnight. And you can see also how I have the whole thing supported on a scrunched up towel. Here's an area that looks like it might need some reinforcement. It looks like the clay is just wanting to separate a little bit right there. And I'm not surprised to see that at every one of these. You want to look for what you think are potentially the weakest areas of your object and turn those into the strongest areas by reinforcing them with extra clay. I'm going to support it so it's gently cushioned all the way around, and it's not going to flatten on the table. The edges of my leaf have gotten a little dry. I'm going to go around with wet fingertips about once every 5 minutes, and I want to keep this outer edge soft. As it starts to dry, it's going to dry on the outer edges first. I'm going to start to do some scraping of this surface. I'm using the metal rib from my toolkit, and I'm using just this corner tip of it right here to start to get into some areas to scrape it smooth. This is a really versatile tool because it's so flexible. You can use the wide part of the curve to hit on more broad areas of your project, or use the smaller part of it. You could even cut this with a pair of scissors if you want to make a smaller shape with it. But because of how much you can flex it in your hand while you're using it, it really has literally endless possibilities for different curved edges that you can drag across to scrape smooth the surface of your piece. Okay, this is how I wrapped up the seashell piece from yesterday. I put plastic just on this top extended part because I knew this would stiffen up quickly, and it has. So before I do anything else, I want to run wet fingertips on that. And then I balance the piece to keep it round using some towels and some crumpled newspaper underneath to support it. So I've been adding on to this piece since yesterday. And this was the one that I didn't have a very clear roadmap of how I was going to build it before I started, but I really like how it's developing. I can start to set it down and think about my preferred viewing angle. I'm also thinking about the textures that I'm going to have on here, and I think this point at the end is going to be a great feature point that I can enhance with texture. Probably this end also. I definitely noticed on the seashell itself, on that end, it looks kind of broken. It's got a different sort of texture right there. It's a little thicker. I'm going to try and bring out some of those qualities. And maybe at the other tip, I'll try and bring some of that spiral onto it. I want to trim it here so that more of this inside surface shows when it's sitting on the table. I'm just going to cut off little slices at a time. Once I have the edge, the shape that I want it, I'm going to start to do some smoothing on it. I'm just going around with wet fingertips here. And I'm kind of pinching the edge in between my wet fingertips and applying a moderate amount of pressure and back and forth smoothing it. I think this piece will look nice with a contrast between some smooth areas and some rough areas. So although I could come and start smoothing it onto the wall section here, I'm going to stop myself from doing that. I kind of like the finger divots that are naturally in this section of wall just from my pinching the clay in place. And I might actually want to come and do that a little bit more. This section right here, I feel like I still need to add a little bit more on there. So I'm going to slip and score back and forth, just like I've been doing this whole time. This is the way that I've been building up the walls for this entire piece. Let it firm up, and then you can just slip and score the edge and keep adding. Take some more soft clay and pinch it in place. I'm really using quite a bit of pressure here to meld the new soft clay in with the cheese hard stuff behind it. With this leaf, I've left it covered like this overnight with just the outer edge wrapped in plastic, but this middle part exposed so that it could firm up some more. I didn't want the edge to get too dry too quickly though. I'm using the metal scraper from the toolkit. I can get in some of these more recessed areas by focusing on this smallest curved part of the rib, but pretty quickly I found that it wasn't able to get into small enough spaces for me. So I have a second rib that I cut with a pair of scissors. I cut this with a few different curves going around it to give me more options. And I just use my regular scissors. This is helping me get around the smaller areas. You can see also that I added the center line coming to each of the points on the leaf. That was something I noticed from looking at the backs of the actual leaves. I like to get my fingers right up close to the edge of the rib, and that way I can have a lot of control and dexterity in how I drag this curve across the surface. The clay has grit, it has grog in it. Grog being those little teeny bits of clay that's already gone through the firing process and ground back up into fine grit and added into our clay body. Grog is the textured scrapey bits that you feel in the clay. And so as I use the metal rib on it, kind of exposing the grog more, and it's leaving these small little dry kind of striations across the surface here, which is kind of a neat texture. I do really like on the original leaves the way the stem comes into the leaf area itself. It seems to make them kind of thrust forward at an interesting angle, and I think I want to make a little stem on my leaf. I'm going to slip and score and add in some more clay here, and I know that if I make something skinny like a stem, it's going to be really fragile and prone to breaking. So with my stem, I'm going to compromise a little bit, make it a little thicker than how the real leaf looks, and I'm going to make it a lot shorter. So I'm going to prep the area and then take some new clay and add it in there. And I really want to try and capture the angle that it comes at. It's like that. It has a slight curve to it. And I'm hoping that I can use this element to help me position the piece on the table. So when I set it like this, it'll hold it at a particular angle. But I obviously have to wait for that to firm up before I can really set it. In the meanwhile, I'm gonna give it some support from this angle. And on this other surface of my leaf, I wanted to have a different texture. I don't want that tip to be pressing against the table while I'm working on it. That could cause some stress in other areas of the leaf. So I want to make sure that it's fully supported all the way underneath. I notice it's getting kind of stiff. This is getting to be later cheese hard. It doesn't have the kind of flex to it that I might want. So I'm just gonna run wet fingertips over the whole thing. If you have a spray bottle at home, you can give it a light mist of water that way too. Again, be careful that you don't have any area of the piece sitting in a puddle of water, or you don't let a puddle of water accumulate on your piece anywhere. That can make it dissolve, which would be bad for your project. So to get this particular texture, I've been adding on small bits of clay with wet fingertips and working them into the surface. I notice on the actual leaf that it has almost like a bumpy, pillowed, almost like a satiny type of surface. It's very smooth, but there's individual little pillows of form on the front surface of the leaf. It seems to make it come forward even more. On this piece, I also want to give a real contrast between a smoother surface on this side and the scratchy, grog, exposed scrape surface on the other side. The edge is really important on this project. I think on any ceramic object, the edge is really important. It becomes like the frame around your piece. Since the edge is exposed to not just the air, but exposed to our eyes, we visually see it all the way around. It becomes a really important area in any ceramic object. It's where you can really show off your sense of finish with the material. And this piece, I'm also using it to give the leaf a little bit more, what I think is a sense of organic vitality. I want the piece to have a sense that it's almost reaching out even more. And I just keep running my fingertips with a little bit of water to finish it all the way around the edge. With this piece from the bulb of garlic, I let it sit overnight with the top half of it wrapped in plastic. I wanted all of this lower part of it to firm up enough so that I could comfortably flip it upside down, but I didn't want the top to get too dry. I've built up on the individual lobes some more by slipping and scoring the edge and adding new clay on. And I've done quite a bit also of shaping them in the direction I wanted so that each one kind of extended out into space. This is pretty stiff right now, and I want to flip it upside down so I can finish the bottom. This is what it looks like right now, and it's really not finished. There's individual clay in some of the joint areas that hasn't been worked in, and it's got this giant gaping hole in it that I'm gonna now build in with clay and finish sculpting this whole area. So to flip it upside down, I need to support it. I'm gonna pack the whole inside with some towels and crumpled newspaper. When I flip this upside down, I want to make sure that it's supported in the middle section of it. And I don't want any of these points to be pressing against the table. That would squish it for sure. This clay is fairly stiff, so I feel like I need to go around several times, really digging into the clay, scratching in quite deep. I can feel how dry and almost crusty it feels as I dig this pin tool tip into the material. It's not ready yet. If I don't slip and score well enough, the new soft clay won't take on here, or it might take for a day or so, but then as it continues to dry, it'll shrink and crack or separate or pop off. Clay shrinks when it dries, and since this area is already late cheese hard, it's already gone through some of that shrinkage process. And the new clay I put on is going to be soft, and so it will undergo more shrinkage than this will. You can get away with that soft to late cheese hard as long as you have this kind of intermediary area where you've slipped and scored to bond the two different stiffnesses of clay together. I can start to feel it becoming more receptive now. There's a feeling you can detect with the tip of your scoring tool where it just sinks into the clay more readily. It doesn't feel so scratchy into dry material. You can feel the softening of the clay material. You can tell when it's ready to add on new clay. Especially this first round of adding in new clay, I really want to make sure that it's joined quite well to the surrounding material. So I'm wrapping my fingers underneath to kind of shove this soft clay in place. I don't want there to be an obvious ridge or bump or bulge or divot where I join this new clay on. I want it to just continue on into the inside here. So I need to do a really thorough job of melding this new clay in place. So here I can see the area where I built in on the bottom, and I'm definitely going to be joining that better on the inside surface too. Maybe I can work on this on the side for a little while, as long as it's supported. I am pushing the new clay in place and melding it onto the existing clay wall, and I'm trying to keep a continuity of shape with the stiffer areas so that it just looks like these keep continuously curving in, and I'm just going to have it reach a point here where they all connect in the middle. Okay, I've been inventing some textures on this seashell piece. I've been applying textures to it, initially inspired by just my finger marks that were in the clay from forming it into shape, but I started to want a little bit more than that, so I started pressing into it more intentionally with the tip of my pinky, and then I picked up a pencil and started pressing in with the eraser. And I really like the softness that the pencil eraser was giving, and I'm using it in kind of a random way around the surface of the piece to make it look kind of bumpy, kind of naturalistic. It doesn't necessarily look like this seashell, like the original one, but it reminds me of some other things that I might see at the beach. And I'm going back over it and kind of softening it. So I think between these different touches I can apply to the surface, my fingers, a pencil eraser, a dry sponge, I'm going to be able to develop something across here that's gonna enhance this form. I also came on the tip of it here and worked on this spiral end to it. And I did some just going around with my pencil and using my pencil as a carving tool. And then coming back with the sponge, kind of erasing those marks and drawing them over again. On the edge of the piece, going all the way around, I'm not going to have it be totally smooth, but I do want it to look finished on the edge. I'm going to come again with wet fingertips, and I'm just going to go all the way around the edge and compress it. I'm going to take the clay particles in the edge itself, and I'm going to kind of seal that finish by pressing it in with my fingertips all the way around, so that I'm letting the audience know that that's where I intended the piece to end. So it doesn't look like it's just ending randomly or I just stopped working on it and called it good. Instead, I'm putting a particular finish onto the edge. On the inside, I'm gonna somewhat smooth it with my sponge. I've been doing a lot of smoothing with my fingers already, but my fingers just can't get in and make it totally smooth everywhere. And this sponge isn't going to make it totally smooth either. You will notice if you do a lot of sponging on the surface of your work that it tends to make it more gritty. As you drag the sponge across the work, the sponge has the quality of washing away all of the very fine clay particles and exposing the grog that's in the clay. So lots of sponging kind of brings the grog up to the surface. On this piece, I made this section here a lot thicker, and I'm going to try and come up with some kind of a shorthand version of what this texture is in there. Maybe I'll use the tip of my wood tool. I want it to look kind of like what you imagine you might see on the inside of a broken bone. I don't always know when I first start making a texture ultimately what it's going to look like. So that's just my first application of that. And as I look at it now, to me, it seems like it's too dominant. I feel like I want to dial it back or make it a little more subtle. The clay's pretty soft here, so I can just erase it with my fingers. I'm making it definitely more unique to something that could only have come from my hands. And I think that's when textures get interesting, when they become kind of your own signature marks that nobody else could make. On the inside of this stem part, there's an area in here that I made really, really thick to start building. It's over an inch thick there, and I need to do something to try and minimize the likelihood that that would explode in the kiln. So I'm just stabbing a series of holes in there, almost like aeration holes, to help the wet air escape when it's being fired in the kiln. Otherwise, this area would never really have a chance to dry completely before we had to fire it. The first part of making it really smooth is scraping off all of the finger bumps. So I'm using the metal rib from the toolkit in a really strong way. As you're doing this, you want to make sure that you're scraping it from multiple different angles. For example, here in this section, I'll do some where I come up across it at this particular angle with my tool. Here I'm coming up mostly vertical and getting into this neck area, scraping all the bumps off, and then I'll do a series of scraping moves where I come across the same section from a different angle. So here I'm coming across it more horizontal. And I might come across it at a third angle. After I've scraped it smooth, then I'm going to go over it with a damp sponge. I need the surface to be a little more damp here to do the final smoothing. The sponge can leave it kind of gritty. So then I'm going to do final smoothing with my rubber rib. And I'm going to get the rubber rib slightly damp also. This is going to take all of the textured bits of grog and push them back into the clay surface, leaving a really smooth finish. It's kind of painstaking to go through this process of making it really, really smooth by scraping it first and then sponging it and then using your rubber rib. But if you have the patience for it, you can really make wonderfully smooth forms and surfaces. I want to do something to help exaggerate the form. I really like the way this flares out at the rim, so I think I'm going to come on the inside and draw a series of lines that help echo that directional quality of the form. I'm just going to use my pencil and come across the clay and incise a series of lines all the way across it. And I'm already anticipating the way the glaze is gonna pool on the inside here. And I'll use a glaze that will enhance all of this texture that I'm putting on. I'm using the sharp edge of this wood stick from my toolkit now, almost more like a stamp to press into the clay. I found that using my pencil tip before was dragging across the clay so much that I was getting a lot of little sharp crumbs on the surface that I didn't like. So I'm using this stick now to more just press these lines into the clay. So I'll still get the sharp lines, but it won't be as scratchy looking. I really like the sense of openness in this piece. I like the asymmetry of it. I really like how it sits on the table on those bumps. I think it has some nice qualities from the original, and I like the transformation that's happened. Sometimes it's really hard to smooth in a tight recessed area. So I'm going to use a paintbrush in there, a wet paintbrush, to cover up some of these little glitches that I couldn't smooth otherwise with my rib. And I mixed up almost kind of like a thin slurry of clay and water, almost like a thin slip of clay. And I'm using the paintbrush kind of like a modeling tool. It's actually moving the clay around on the surface. I like to use a rough paintbrush for something like this, and I find that if I have the right mixture of clay slip with the right coarseness of paintbrush, it can actually leave these brush mark striations on the surface, which in this piece I think references back to the original bulb of garlic. I'm being careful not to add too much water to the piece right now. It's in the late cheese hard state, and I know if I get it too wet, it could do damage to the structural integrity of the piece and start to dissolve it and weaken the joints. So I'm going to keep brushing this liquid around so it doesn't gather in any one spot for too long. Some of the subtlety of this surface might get covered up with the glaze, but maybe not. I really like how smooth that makes it. With this piece, I really like the way I was able to take something as simple as a leaf and turn it into something really dimensional and substantial. It looks like it's blowing in the wind right now. I'm intrigued by this new texture I've invented on the outside, and maybe I'll want to do a little bit more of that. And I really like the details of these two textures at either end. I'm happy with the way that it's come to rest. And one of the last things I have to do is make sure I get my initials and number on the bottom So I'm gonna pick a spot like right here, and I'm gonna use my custom stamp. You also make sure you have your actual initials and the number that was assigned to you at the beginning of the term etched into your piece too.